Well, I have to say I'm absolutely stunned to see this many people, so thank you all for coming out. I'd like to believe it's for me, but I'm sure it's for the topic, right? Well, as many of you probably know, today is Veterans Day observed. Yesterday was the actual 100th anniversary of the ending of World War I. And so what I would like to talk about today a little bit is the ending of that war. We're obviously going to have to cover a bit of the war itself, but with a topic this large, I am of course going to be grossly simplifying certain things and sweeping over other things. So please feel free during the Q&A to ask me anything that I left unclear or that I didn't speak about. Now, I also want to say that I'm going to be talking just about 1918. If you really want to learn about more of this, in the spring we're going to be hosting another lecture with our own Dr. Hepp, who will be speaking about the 100th anniversary of the Versailles Peace Treaty, which ended the war. So it's kind of a 2-for-1. So please come back in the spring to see that. So without further ado, I'd like to begin our story just a couple days before that fateful day of November 11th, 1918. On November 8th, 1918, a car carrying a small peace delegation crossed the front lines of the Western Front, a killing field that had reshaped the physical landscape of northeast France and Belgium. And inside that car was not a top-ranking military commander, but rather a bespectacled politician who had been advocating for peace since early 1917. His name was Matthias Erzberger, and he had been dispatched to seek out terms from the Allied powers represented most prominently by France, Britain, and the United States in order to end the First World War. Now, the day after Erzberger crossed the front lines, the government that sent him, that of Kaiser Wilhelm II, would cease to exist as the forces of social revolution swept over Germany. Politicians of the Social Democrat Party, led by Friedrich Ebert, announced the end of the German Empire and the creation of the German Republic on November 9th. While the political chaos enveloping Germany back home certainly didn't help Erzberger's negotiating position, he did have one strong card to play. Despite huge battlefield setbacks, crumbling morale, and increasing desertions, the German army remained in the field. Now, to the Allied powers, this seemed a bit academic. The tide of battle had turned to the point that the Allied victory seemed increasingly inevitable. The commander-in-chief of the British and French forces, French Field Marshal Ferdinand Foch, certainly believed such and treated Erzberger and the German delegation with thinly veiled contempt. Foch and his comrades offered Erzberger staggeringly harsh terms for an armistice and gave the German delegation just 72 hours to accept it. Erzberger telegraphed Berlin for instructions, but in the chaos he received no definitive answer until November 10th, when the head of the German Supreme Command, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, telegraphed the German delegation that they had no choice but to accept the armistice terms. Now, crucially for our story, however, that was not the final word. In the early hours of November 11th, the new democratic government of Friedrich Ebert signaled that Erzberger had its authorization to sign the armistice. The two sides therefore gathered in Foch's rail car at the forest of Compiègne and signed the armistice at 5 a.m. on November 11th, with the ceasefire taking effect 6 hours later. This was not the first armistice. Germany's allies, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary had already capitulated, and some feared it would not be the last. Concerned that the armistice could collapse, some battlefield commanders were determined to fight on to the bitter end. And there were nearly 11,000 more casualties on November 11th, including 3,000 deaths. American Henry Gunther was widely considered to be the last battlefield casualty, falling at 10:59, 1 minute before the armistice took effect. When the clock turned to 11 a.m., however, the guns did indeed fall silent, seeming to bring an end to Europe's brutal and bloody civil war. But almost from the beginning, the meaning of what appeared to be a very definitive event began to be contested by the various sides involved. News of the armistice quickly circulated. In France, Britain, the United States, and the other allied countries, jubilant celebrations erupted on the news of the cessation of hostilities. Almost immediately, the date of November 11th took on almost sacred significance for the victorious powers. The coincidence that the war had ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month seemed almost spiritually apt. And in the aftermath of the war, the date of November 11th was immediately consecrated. On the first anniversary, King George V hosted the President of France for a joint commemoration of the end of the war. These ceremonies only grew in solemnity and elaboration as battlefield monuments began to be dedicated to the lost. The response here in the United States was similar. Woodrow Wilson, our president at the time, issued a formal proclamation on the day of 1919 stating, quote, "To us in America, the reflections on Armistice Day will be filled with solemn pride in the heroism of those who died in the country's service, and with gratitude for the victory, both because of the thing from which it has freed us and because of the opportunity it has given America to show her sympathy and peace and justice in the Council of Nations." Congress followed this up by making yearly proclamations on the date a requirement in 1926 and formally making Armistice Day a holiday in 1938. But it was Wilson himself who signaled that not all was well with the world created by the ending of the First World War. In a radio address to commemorate the 5th anniversary of the ending of the war in 1923, a sickly and frail Wilson, just a few months away from death, warned darkly of America's failure to engage in the post-war world, an abrogation of duty he believed that was allowing the gains of the war to slowly slip away. And Wilson was right to be concerned. Although the transformation of Europe following the war had been startling, with the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire all ceasing to exist, the way that the war ended on November 11th, 1918, had actually created a set of circumstances wherein the defeat of Germany was not truly and fully accepted by those who waged war. The German military and public elements that adhered to the far right and ultra-nationalist politics almost immediately after the signing of the armistice began to speak darkly of betrayal, or even the fact that the proud German army had been stabbed in the back by cowardly democratic forces and others, other peoples not wholly committed to the survival of the German nation, which was code words for Jews. These right-wing forces branded the Democratic politicians who signed the armistice the November criminals for their betrayal of Germany. Matthias Erzberger was himself assassinated just 2 years later by ultra-right-wing nationalists. While the stab in the back myth remains somewhat of an outlier amongst the majority of Germans, it found a home in the consciousness of the nation, particularly in the right-wing nationalist parties that used it to rail against the post-war settlement, the Versailles Treaty, and even democracy itself. One party in particular, as you'll notice here, what's on this helmet of this German soldier? A swastika. The National Socialist Democratic Workers' Party, better known as the Nazis, made the stab in the back myth an important aspect of their propaganda as the party contested elections. Adolf Hitler himself was a firm proponent of this myth and was himself a frontline soldier on November 11th. In fact, the architect of the German war effort, pictured here, Erich Ludendorff, who will be a very significant character for our story today, ran for president as a member of the Nazi Party in 1924. If there's any doubt as to the importance of this date to Hitler and his followers, one needs only look to the act of symbolism that Hitler insisted upon during the surrender of French forces on the 21st of June 1940 during the opening days of the Second World War. On their defeat, Hitler ordered the Campagna wagon, where the Germans had signed the armistice in 1918, to be dragged from the museum in which it was being stored, brought back to the forest of Campagna, and the French forces forced to sit in the seat that Erzberger had sat in to sign the armistice, while Hitler occupied the place of Ferdinand Foch. To make sure that the message was received, the entire site was then obliterated. Thus, we can see that the meaning of November 11th, 1918 remained very much contested. What was actually a definitive and complete defeat for the Germans was reimagined into an origin myth for the form of ultranationalism that would give rise to both the birth of the Nazi movement as well as the Second World War. The question, therefore, must be one of why. Why did the war end the way that it did in 1918? Why did the Allies sign an armistice when the Germans were on the brink of absolute and total collapse? Now, while the answer to this question is complex, the short answer is that the reason the different belligerent powers entered the war has much to do with how and why the war ended the way and when it did. The goals and rationales of the different warring states used to justify the war obviously dictated the scope and shape of the peace. Now, it's not surprising to find out that the belligerent powers on opposing sides had very different views of what they wanted out of the war, but what may surprise you is that the Allies did too. Each of the Allied states wanted something different. The Germans had a quite simple view. Since the formation of Germany in 1871, they had believed themselves to be surrounded by hostile powers, powers committed to keeping Germany down, powers committed to preventing Germany from expanding and taking its role on the world stage. This ethos, which was shared by many other European strategists, gave rise to a sense within Germany that it was surrounded by hostile powers. The Franco-Russian alliance of the early 1890s created enemies on both sides of Germany. The Entente Cordiale, which brought Britain into a loose partnership with France, only seemed to confirm that Germany was cut off from its historical destiny. Thus, from early in the 20th century, German strategists and military planners prepared for a war that they believed would smash this encirclement and free Germany to pursue its world path. This meant occupying and annexing Belgium, defeating France, and conquering much of Middle and Eastern Europe to create what they called Mitteleuropa, a zone of German influence which Germany would become if not the predominant world power. Obviously, the French and British had very different views of what they wanted, and much of it included keeping this from happening. For the British and the French, their war aims were simple: to knock Germany down a peg. While they had different views of how exactly to do this, France wanted its old province, Alsace-Lorraine, back, an important strategic zone. For the British, it was disarming the German Navy. But for both of them, it was to knock the Germans back into a sense of submission, perhaps even breaking up Germany itself. Thus, at the beginning of the war, in 1914, we have two hostile camps with very and mutually antipathetic views. When America entered the war, things got even more complicated. When America entered the war in 1917, they did not join the Allied powers. America never allied itself to Britain and France. We had a common enemy in Germany, but we were in no way allied. The United States, instead, under the leadership of Woodrow Wilson, argued that the war could only be ended with the creation of a liberal democratic international order, led first and foremost by the United States. Thus, we can see very different views. And we can also see that these complex and intermixed war aims meant that opposing sides would have a difficult time finding common ground to end the war. And as we will also see, the events of the war seem to conspire to bring the sides painfully close to peace at numerous instances, only to have peace snatched away by the tide of events. Efforts to restore the peace began almost as soon as the war began. As the war began between Germany, Austria-Hungary, eventually its allies, Bulgarian, Ottoman, and Britain, France, Italy, and Russia, the war begins in a way few had expected. The Germans planned for victory over France in 6 weeks. When this failed to occur, when their battle strategy to seize Paris failed, the supreme commander of the High Command, Colonel General Helmut von Moltke, reportedly informed his wife that, quote, "The fighting east of Paris has not gone in our favor, and we shall have to pay for the damage we have done." He reportedly told the Kaiser in August of 1914, "My Kaiser, the war is lost." Well, in fact, the war was not lost. Germany was saved by a miraculous victory in the east by the joint command of Paul von Hindenburg and his lieutenant, Erich Ludendorff. This victory dragged Germany back onto the battlefield and meant that the war would continue. But as the war dragged into the harsh stalemate of 1915, dreams of a quick victory quickly vanished. All of this contributed to a sense that 1916 would be a decisive year for the war. The Allies had planned coordinated offensives, but a surprise major German attack on the French fortress city of Verdun threw all of that into question. The Battle of Verdun turned into an epic slaughter. And in response, the British stepped up their efforts to launch their own offensive, a massive offensive involving nearly 3 million troops and a 12-mile stretch of the front known as the Somme. The new army of volunteers trained in Britain in 1915 was thrown into battle in the summer of 1916. And on the first day of this battle, the British Army suffered 57,000 casualties, including 19,000 deaths in one day. The battle lasted from July to November and ultimately claimed over 1 million casualties on the two sides. Combined with Verdun, we talk about almost 2 million casualties on the Western Front. And this is the ground that was taken for 2 million casualties. Barely a few bloody kilometers. As you can probably imagine, at the end of this, many people called for peace. Well, in Germany, this call for peace was made by many of the Democratic politicians. But far from listening to them, the Kaiser instead turned over complete control of the war to Hindenburg and Ludendorff. With Hindenburg being a figurehead, the effective military dictator of Germany became Erich Ludendorff. They had plans other than peace. Now, public opinion on both sides murmured for peace, but with the war continuing to drag on, it looked like the moment for peace might slip away. But one place where this message of peace was met and was answered was the United States. Near the end of 1916, as the Allies began to try to raise more money off of Wall Street from J.P. Morgan to continue their war effort, the Federal Reserve announced to its branch offices that they were no longer allowed to help any private U.S. bank assist in raising more money for the Allies. Given the fact that the Allies had about 6 weeks' worth of money left, this effectively meant the threat of bankruptcy for the Allied powers. The Fed received this directive straight from the top, from Woodrow Wilson himself. Wilson was convinced that the futile slaughter of 1916 was evidence that the war needed to be brought to an end. And if the Allies were worried that Wilson intended to bankrupt them, they weren't far from the truth. London and Paris were thus especially alarmed when just a few weeks later, the Germans, out of the blue, offered peace negotiations. London and Paris realized that going to the table now, with Germany occupying most of Belgium and significant portions of France, could only end in a peace that strengthened Germany and made the sacrifices of the last 2 years for nothing. They also knew that rejecting this call for negotiation was dangerous. So imagine their shock when just a week later, Woodrow Wilson stepped in and offered to mediate between the two sides. The Allies realized that if they rebuffed Wilson, their hope for more money was gone. Luckily for them, in a catastrophic blunder, the Germans rejected this mediation, believing that J.P. Morgan's huge loans to the Allies would mean that the Americans could not be an honest broker. Wilson was not deterred, however, and in January of 1917, he gave an unprecedented address to the Senate in which he called for peace without victory for the European powers. Wilson argued that, quote, victory would mean peace forced upon the loser. It would be accepted in humiliation, under duress, at an intolerable sacrifice, and would leave a sting, a resentment, a bitter memory upon which the terms of peace would rest, not permanently, but only as upon quicksand. This was extremely prescient of Wilson. But little did he know that even as he called for America being an honest mediator, forces were in action that would push America off of this lofty perch and into the trenches itself. Despite desperate pleas from the German ambassador to Washington for the German government to take seriously Wilson's call for peace and effort at mediation, telegrams streaming across the Atlantic that Wilson is serious, take him up, listen to him. Ludendorff had already ordered the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare against American shipping a few days before Wilson's speech. The submarines were already on their way, and nothing could be done to call them back. The window for peace in early 1917 was therefore slammed shut. But it was not only German actions that were changing the face of the war. Just weeks after Wilson broke off diplomatic relations with Germany in early February of 1917, protesters began taking to the streets of the Russian capital of St. Petersburg. These protests, led mainly by women at first, were a manifestation of the Russian people's anger at high prices, food shortages, and the disastrous war. When the local garrison joined the strikers, the protests turned into a revolution and forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate his throne. The February Revolution, as it's come to be known, had huge consequences for the war and the eventual peace. Whoop.
Excuse me.
You okay?
Excuse me, I'm okay, yeah. Trying to get up.
Had huge consequences. The replacement of the most repressive regime in Europe with a true democracy changed the face of the war. It had two big consequences. It now made the Allied effort a war for democracy against authoritarianism. This changed opinion within Germany. The democratic parties within Germany had supported this war in part to fight the repression of the Russians. Now many of them considered a war against democracy to be a war that they didn't want to fight any longer. It also reinvigorated the Allied cause, who could now claim that they were fighting to save democracy. And on this second point, an even bigger impact. Despite severing ties with Germany, the United States had still tried to remain out of the war. But finally, a combination of German attacks and diplomatic pressure meant that the United States declared war in April of 1917. Even with America now entering the war, the dream of peace without victory was not completely dead. The new democratic government in Russia had little desire to keep fighting a war of imperialist expansion, and they put together a formula for peace. A formula for peace which effectively was peace without victory, Wilson's formula. Meanwhile, German democratic politicians from the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, and the liberals similarly put out a call for peace, going so far as to vote for it in the Reichstag, the German parliament. The pressure for peace grew even more intense as mutinies began to sweep over the French army. 54 divisions suffering mutinies. That's about 500,000 troops in mutiny against the war, calling for all sides to bring about Wilson's vision of peace without victory, whether leadership wanted it or not. But once again, events would intercede to dash the hopes for a collective peace. In an effort to put the cat amongst the pigeons, German secret agents had actually assisted in the return of a leader of the most radical socialist party to Russia in April of 1917, Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was smuggled across German territory and back into Russia, where he reinvigorated the Bolshevik Party, a radical socialist party committed to immediately ending the war. Well, with the war dragging on and the democratic government in Russia losing popularity, the Bolsheviks seized their opportunity at the end of October, early November 1917. They toppled the democratic government, seized control, and began immediate peace talks with the Germans. With Russia descending into social revolution and effectively seeking a separate peace, the remaining allies faced a moment of crisis. And it was in this context that Wilson gave his most famous speech. On the 8th of January 1918, Wilson laid out a vision for the creation of a liberal democratic world order. His so-called 14-point peace plan was an updated and strengthened version of the plan he had laid out before, but with a reinforced focus on the principle of self-determination for all nations. The centerpiece of his 14-point peace plan was the idea of creating a League of Nations, an international organization committed to arbitration and peaceful settlement of disputes, and the institution of international law. What he was essentially calling for was peace through a transition to democracy and an embrace of international law upholding a free and open global economy. Wilson's rhetoric frustrated his allies, who once again considered him to be putting himself as the president of the world. But it was enthusiastically embraced by many. The idea of a just and democratic end to the war reinvigorated the opposition within Germany, and these politicians of the German center and left saw an opportunity to prove their democratic bona fides to Wilson when, over the next few months, negotiations with the Bolsheviks looked set to grant Germany wide territorial concessions in Central and Eastern Europe. These politicians believed that if Germany acted benevolently toward these new territories, granted them self-determination and a transition to democracy, that Wilson would look on them favorably and that they could negotiate a peace from a position of magnanimous strength. Being magnanimous in victory, they argued, could help bring about a peace without victory of the sorts that Wilson had been calling for. The problem was that these democratic politicians weren't calling the shots. Erich Ludendorff was. These territorial concessions, you can see all the area granted of the Western Russian Empire, all of Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, the Baltics, Finland. What idea does this look like? Well, when Germany wanted to start the war, what did they want to conquer? They wanted to conquer exactly this territory. And Ludendorff would be damned if he would let it go. Ludendorff saw this as a chance to fulfill Germany's great destiny. Why would he throw it away now? And this increased the stakes for Ludendorff and his followers. Germany now seemed on the brink of winning everything that they had set out for. And the only thing standing in their way of total victory were the Western allies, who are now being rapidly reinforced by the newly arriving American army. Ludendorff therefore brought most of Germany's Eastern army, freed from fighting the Russians, and threw them into a massive offensive in the spring of 1918. Despite advances that dwarfed anything seen since August of 1914, the Allied forces rallied and blunted the offensive by July. Here's Paris. They came within 60 kilometers of Paris. In fact, German artillery bombarded the city at the height of the offensive. But despite this, the offensive failed. Ludendorff's decision to forego peace while he had a strong hand now showed itself to be a catastrophe, a disaster. He had spent the flower of the German army and most of its remaining resources, not to mention its morale, in a fruitless offensive. And even worse, the Allies were now buoyed by huge American reinforcements, 10,000 Americans arriving every day to join the war. A massive Allied counterattack added to Germany's woes. But even worse, however, for our story, was that the German people at home were completely unaware of any of this. Propaganda and censorship had led the vast majority of Germans, now suffering through rationing of bread at 110 grams a day. That's the amount of bread the German people got every day. It's about that. They had been led to believe that victory was imminent, that Ludendorff would lead them to victory. The perilous situation at the front was hidden. When the massive Allied 100 Days Offensive began in August, it became clear that defeat was inevitable. Yet with information tightly controlled, the German home front still expected imminent victory. It was not until mid-September of 1918 that it became clear to most of the German leadership back home that the war was going disastrously sideways. Repeated blows by the Allies had pushed the Germans back, including the Meuse-Argonne offensive, in which 120,000 American casualties punctured through the line. The British commander, Douglas Haig, said, "We have the enemy down and we must pound him until he begs for mercy." Well, how very British. Now, in mid-September, Austria-Hungary, Germany's main ally, made a plea for peace. They could not keep the war going. In late September, Bulgaria, another crucial ally, capitulated. Supposedly, when Ludendorff heard this news, he fell to the floor and rolled, screaming. He quickly recovered enough, however, to recommend to the Kaiser that same day, the 29th of September, that the war was lost and that the country needed to seek out terms. Ludendorff then made another damning move. He suggested that a new democratic government be created in the hopes that it would receive better terms from Wilson than the Kaiser would. Ludendorff was not altruistic in this. He realized that by creating a democratic government, who would get the blame for the defeat? Not him, but the Democrats. The Kaiser responded by having a liberal politician named Max von Baden put into the position of chancellor. Von Baden immediately reached out on October 7th to Wilson and asked for a peace based on the 14 points and a complete evacuation of all German areas occupied. When Wilson further inquired, von Baden repeated and claimed he wanted peace without victory, using Wilson's own words. While Wilson contemplated this offer, this was exactly what he had wanted all along: a democratic peace. The other allies were furious. Perhaps if the Germans had made this offer in March, it would have been acceptable, but now the German army was on the back foot. It was nearing the point of collapse, and it seemed to the British and French as a bit of too little too late. To increase his chances of getting a liberal peace, Wilson therefore pushed the Germans. He himself wrote a telegram in response, demanding that as proof of their actual transition to democracy, the Kaiser abdicate. Well, this demand exploded the tense political situation in Germany. Ludendorff himself was incensed to see his plans to put the peace negotiations in the hands of civilians go so far off the rails. He returns to Berlin in an effort to rally conservative forces to fight to the death to support the Kaiser. But on October 26th, he was fired by Prince Max von Baden. Ludendorff's aides commented sadly that the great general had been stabbed in the back by his supposed friends, just like one of the most famous operatic figures in German cultural history, the great heroes Siegfried and Richard Wagner's Götterdämmerung, stabbed in the back at the moment of victory by a man he's supposed to be his friend, Hagen. Ludendorff took small solace in this, but the idea stuck. A mutiny in the Navy had spread throughout the country, and desertions on the front lines had sapped the Germans' ability to continue to resist. This presented the British and the French with a wrenching decision. They realized that the German army was on the brink of collapse. Further fighting would almost certainly result in complete and total victory. But there were real risks. If fighting went on for even a few more months, the army that defeated Germany would almost certainly be predominantly American, giving the sanctimonious Wilson an even stronger hand in the post-war period. The issue, therefore, became one of not if the Allies would win, but when they would choose to win. For Wilson, encouraging the democratic transition was imperative to his future vision of a peaceful, democratic international order. For the British and French, a crushing military victory which crippled Germany's ability to threaten them was essential to justify the costs of the war. Therefore, the Allies split the difference. In exchange for an early armistice that would forestall the collapse of Germany's nascent democracy into either a left-wing or right-wing revolution, Wilson conceded the right to the French and British Commander-in-Chief Ferdinand Foch to set the military terms of the armistice. The result was that the armistice signed by Erzberger on November 11th was early, but incredibly harsh, stripping the German military of its weaponry, forcing them to retreat back into Germany, and offering up large sections of the country to military occupation by the Allied armies. This early armistice brought relief to the new German Republic, but by signing the ceasefire while the German army was still in the field and technically undefeated, the harsh military terms imposed by Foch came as a shock to many within the military and their supporters at home. The aftermath of the events of November 11th therefore cast a long shadow. The multitude of conflicting interests of the warring parties meant that the 11th of November was a compromise solution that was open to interpretation by all sides. For the British and the French, it marked a total surrender of the Germans, the one that they had longed for. For Wilson and the Americans, it was a peace with honor that would allow the German Democrats to survive and thrive. But to the Germans, it was all the more complicated. The news rippled throughout the shocked population, who wartime censorship had insulated from the closeness of defeat. And one person for whom the news hit particularly hard was a young corporal in the German army who was laid up in a military hospital recovering from temporary blindness caused by a British gas attack. When the hospital chaplain explained to the patients on November 11th that the war had been lost, a young Adolf Hitler collapsed onto his cot and wept. Can anybody tell me which one's Hitler?
Far right.
Here he is, before he made his famous mustache. To Hitler, the true cause of the defeat was obvious. 6 years after the armistice, he wrote in Mein Kampf, "But it remained for the Jews, with their unqualified capacity for falsehood, and their fighting comrades, the Marxists. By placing responsibility for the loss of the war on the shoulders of Ludendorff, they took away the weapon of moral right from the only adversary dangerous enough to be likely to succeed in bringing the betrayers of the fatherland to justice. We, of course, know the consequences of these ideas. Yet the defeat of November 11th hung over Hitler's entire political career. In fact, as his much more definitive defeat loomed in 1945, one of Hitler's final acts was to order the SS to destroy the Campania rail car, which had been brought to Berlin as a trophy of victory. One could say, however, that with the destruction of that symbol of German defeat and Nazi victory, as the regime of Adolf Hitler collapsed into ruin, marked the true end of the war. A defeat that in 1945 was unambiguous and complete. Thank you very much.